Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Morning.
There we go. I want to thank you all for coming out to our last edition of Java with Joe for the year, because as much as we love each other, I don't think we'll be here on Thanksgiving and Christmas. Just a thought, but that's all right. So we'll be closing out 2023 season with a bang. We've got our very own Curator Tyler Angora here, who is going to talk about Victorian Era Mourning, and it felt like the perfect way to close out our Batavia Cemetery exhibit, and what perfect time to talk about mourning than October. So
That's right.
Also, what better time to talk about mourning than at 9 in the morning over a donut? hopefully you don't choke. All right. So, Victorian mourning. So, I bet you're wondering, what was mourning in the Victorian period? So, mourning culture and death culture exploded in the 19th century. Before that, mourning was a thing, but it wasn't as prevalent or as ritualized as it was in the 19th century. So, in America, before the turn of the 19th century, during the colonial period, women often would tend to the body, take care of it, and there wouldn't really be much around it after that. They would hold a very small ceremony of just close family and friends, but a lot of times it was just a family-oriented matter. They would often just follow the casket once, and it was normally a wooden casket, so it wasn't anything too elaborate. They would often wrap the body, put it in the casket, and then they would follow it to the cemetery, which was often near a church or behind the church, and they would bury it, and they would say a few things and go about their business and mourn, but it wasn't like it was in the 19th century. Towards the 1830s is when it kind of exploded due to the rural cemetery movement. So in the 1830s, rural cemetery movement kind of exploded across America. So big cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, all had designated larger plots of land that weren't near churches. They were kind of their own separate entities. And they kind of did this to A, have more space to bury people, but also to kind of have nature's beauty around more than anything, especially with the development of gravestones. Because back then you would often only have a wooden gravestone. Towards the 19th century, 1800s, wooden gravestones were kind of fading out because they didn't last, and stone gravestones really took over, and they became very elaborate and very showy. So that kind of aided the rural cemetery movement. And it wasn't just a cemetery to bury people. Cemeteries back then were used as kind of a park, essentially. A lot of people had picnics, they would go for strolls. It kind of became part of their daily routine to kind of go and stroll through the cemetery. It wasn't looked at somewhere where you just bury your loved one and go and pay your respects. It was kind of seen as a beautiful entity in the community, and they really embraced that. They would often do carriage picnics. They would go just walk and have lots of fun. But in around, if I could find the exact date, in 1843 in New York is when the Rural Cemetery Act was passed, which allowed for the commercialization of burials to commence, which brought the rise of the mortician, because you could finally pay somebody to bury your body for you. So now I can collect on all of your dead bodies, just letting you know. So the mortician really brought death culture to the forefront, because you saw elaborate funerals starting to take place. Women were no longer wrapping or taking care of the body after. They would often pay somebody to do it if you were in a higher class stance. If you were not, you still did that. So middle to upper class really used the morticians to do this part, and it allowed families to no longer be responsible for that kind of part, because I'm not gonna lie, I don't really want to take care of my mom's dead body. Just putting it out there. And then with this mortician, it kind of gave the families an outlet to plan for death during this point. So people started planning funerals, planning to have elaborate caskets, planning their gravestones ahead of time, and it kind of ritualized things. I mean, even today, people still plan these things ahead. That's why we have life insurance. But it really took hold, and it kind of really made this thing into what it is, and it just exploded and made something very, very polarizing, because we don't have this today, making it very interesting to see that death was such a big thing, and people really expanded on it. And one of the biggest things was mourning etiquette. Don't know about you, this doesn't exist today. I walked to a funeral and there's people in jeans. But I digress. So mourning etiquette was really what took hold of death culture back then. There was many rules, many ways that people had to custom their life following the death of a loved one. One of the biggest things and one of the creepiest things were death portraits, which I did not include because that is very creepy and I don't want to scare you already. So death portraits were one of the biggest things to take hold in the 19th century. I'm sure many of you have heard of infant portraits of dead babies back then. I don't recommend looking them up on Google. You'll be terrified. So what happened back then is that they would often take the deceased and prop them in a kind of a photo way with backdrop and everything and take a portrait of the deceased, then go forward with burying them. Along with that also came death announcements. So death announcements became a big thing, which you just walked past entering this room, one of Adeline Richmond's. So that was kind of a big thing to announce your death to the public. So her and Mary Richmond, we have both their death announcements from the Holland Purchase Historical Society. But you would often hand out calling cards wrapped with black edging around the card. So that indicated mourning. So a lot of stationery was produced during this time to represent that. But also another lovely thing that was brought in was length periods. So, sorry Diane, if your husband dies, you're in mourning for 2 years, there's nothing you can really do about it. You'll have to be dressed in black. So based on the relation to the person, you were often put into a set time of mourning. And most people, once you did this, knew about that time. So if I handed out a card that my wife died, I would often only be in mourning for 6 months, whereas if she handed out a card for me, she'd be in mourning for 2 years, and people kind of knew not to do anything or involve themselves with that person, unless of course you were Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, and that only lasted about a month. But besides the worst representation of the 1860s, I'll go past that. But another also big thing was this thing right here. So hair jewelry during the 19th century kind of exploded. We had hair art before that, which is in our cemetery exhibit. So hair art wasn't really a mourning thing, it was kind of an art. So people did it often with their own hair, but it also transcended into mourning culture. You could use the deceased hair, but mourning jewelry is really where that comes about, with using hair to mourn and to respect your loved ones. So pieces like that amulet up there, they would often take a clipping of their hair, store it in an amulet, and kind of hold it close to them. Or if you were a man, you had a watch band or a waistcoat strap made out of your loved one's hair, which is in the cemetery exhibit. So that was a big thing, and it often grosses people out, which I don't defend them because it is kind of creepy. I mean, but also another thing along with the death portraits were beads. So along with the death portraits, hair jewelry, and length times, you also commemorated your own mourning process with your own portraits. So as you can see in that daguerreotype, this little girl is mourning her father. She's holding a photo of her dad. And this was very prevalent with women also, so there's lots of photos of women in their full mourning with their veils, their dresses, holding a photo of their husband. Or like Mary Todd Lincoln, you would have a photo done with your husband holding you from the back as like a ghost in the photo, which transcends into spiritualism. But that's not why we're here. If you want to know, ghost walks. But women, as I mentioned, so mourning was really a gendered kind of role in society. So women kind of took hold of this kind of aspect of life. Men didn't really participate, they didn't really plan anything. Women kind of took care of it all. So they did the funerary plans, they did the calling cards themselves, they did the announcements. It was really centralized around women doing this rather than anybody else. And they really made sure that their families stayed in line during this mourning period because it was very, very customary. You had to be in this period, you had to commemorate, you had to respect the dead. So women were kind of that central key role in doing that. So, sorry ladies, if you die, I can't help you there with your husband's mourning. But another big thing about women was their attire. So this is the most polarizing aspect of mourning. So during this 2-year period, you were kind of separated into 2 sectors of mourning. So the first year was called first mourning. The second year was called second mourning. So what I have up here is a dress from the 1860s, which is considered a first year mourning dress. So back then, for mourning, you would often not have jewels on your dress, no lace, no ruffles. You would have to be very plain to show that you're not elaborating on anything. So this dress is very plain besides the velveteen straps right there, but that was not uncommon back then for velveteen to be used in mourning practices, which I'll talk about later. So this dress is very plain, whereas this one would be considered a second mourning dress. So this is from about 1894. So this dress is considered second mourning because it does have adornments on it. So your first year you would not have any of this, emphasis on why that's a first mourning dress. So this dress has very big ruffles around the sleeves. It has lace and jet beading pretty much anywhere where a cuff or a fold would be. So it's very second mourning. But with second mourning, you could also bring in different colors other than black. So in second mourning, I don't know if any of you have watched Downton Abbey. The Dowager, she is in complete mourning until her death. She wears second mourning colors, same thing as Queen Victoria. So in second mourning, you would often bring in elements of dark grays, mauves, light purples, lavender, and even you could splash in a little white, which you saw in Queen Victoria quite often. She is right there. She has a white collar with white cuffs and a white bonnet on her head. So that was very indicative of second mourning. So in Downton Abbey, the Dowager wears the dark purples. She often wears black to events. She is very indicative of showing her mourning as she lives on the rest of her life, which is what Queen Victoria did, which she made death very prominent. People looked to her for that. Once her husband died, she was in mourning till the rest of her days until she died. She was never seen wearing any other color other than second mourning color. She was mostly in black. That was about it. But it was very interesting because you advertised this. So it was kind of a custom for women to own these clothing in case this ever happened. Because again, you had different mourning periods for different people. You still had to wear black. So even her parents, if they died, her kids, her aunts, uncles, she would still be expected to wear some sort of black that wasn't decorated. So a lot of fashion plates and magazines back then had a section for women's mourning clothing to be advertised. So it was very, very interesting to go through and find those kinds of things. But say if you weren't middle to upper class back then and you were part of the common people, part of my social group, And you couldn't afford that, because I couldn't afford this. These are some expensive dresses up here. So they actually created dye packets for you to bring home and dye your own clothing black. So you would often have to dye your petticoats, a dress that wasn't your Sunday best because you don't want to ruin that dress. So you would often dye just a cotton dress at home, which was not great because dyes back then, it was not a natural dye that they used. It was a very chemical infused dye. And it often led to rashes and boils and stuff all over their skin. But you had to do what you had to do to respect the dead.
The good old days.
Watch it, mister. So even if you were part of the working class, you still had to do these customs, and they made sure you could by making those dye packets for you to do at home, which would often lead you not in the best stance. But finally, let's talk about men, because I can't just talk about women. That would be boring. Men. Mourning existed not very long. It was kind of a flat line for men. You would mourn your wife for about a year, if that. If you found somebody else, you kind of moved on with your life. But as you can see, these men are in mourning. So this man has a black band around his sleeve, which brings me back to this dress. So that was not uncommon for you to have that on your sleeves. So men wore a black cuff on their sleeve, because again, men's suits, you could have bought them again, but why would you? And a lot of men's suits in the 19th century weren't colorful anyway. They were mostly gray, black, a lighter gray. So to reproduce that is kind of not purposeful. So they would just do the black band on their arm, they would wear black gloves, and that would be about it, instead of a woman having to purchase a whole new outfit. Or for a man, they could do their top hat. So you could put a larger band around the base of your top hat. So a normal band for a top hat is about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, where those bands are about 5 inches. So when you're walking down the street, you could typically sense a man in mourning if he didn't have his band on, but if he had his band on, you would know prominently. But he does not have a band on, so his hat tells you he's mourning. But again, men weren't prominent in this aspect of life. They assisted sometimes, but even if their wife passed away, often their wife's sister or their parents would take care of the funerary issues rather than the man. Because again, women were at home, they weren't working. It wasn't their job, because they were off making the money for them to buy these lovely gowns for them to wear when they died. But mourning and death culture in the 19th century, to me, is very polarizing because we don't see this today. And it was very large in that period, and it hasn't been long since this occurred. It's only been 100 years since it kind of really stopped. Because towards the 19th century is when we get into our newer mourning practices, where you would wear black to a funeral, but you wouldn't mourn for as long. You wouldn't go out and buy new stationery, new dresses, you wouldn't do any of that following kind of the 1910s. So about 1920 is when we get into our modern day, I'll say, practices of mourning. But even now it's changing because people don't wear black to funerals as often. People don't wear their Sunday best to funerals. I've been to a lot of funerals in the last 5 years of my life. And I don't see that anymore, whereas my mom told me, you wear your Sunday best, you wear black to a funeral unless you're told otherwise. So if people aren't telling you that, it's not really a thing anymore. So that's kind of why it's very polarizing, because 100 years ago, this was huge. I mean, funerals were occurring every day. You saw people in mourning almost every day. Now I could walk past anyone and not notice anything. So it's a very polarizing fact. And And not to plug the Genesee Country Village Museum, but they're doing a whole exhibit on the rural cemetery movement next year, and it's going to talk about all of this kind of funerary stuff that occurred in the 19th century. And Sharon talks about it a little in her exhibit for the cemetery, which is very important. And she has provided us with many artifacts from the cemetery, including the original ledger book that includes the first burial in 1823. But here, our rural cemetery is the historic Batavia Cemetery, because again, it's a very elaborate cemetery, and you can thank Mr. Richmond for his lovely mausoleum, which is very eye-catching when you go down Harvester, because to find a mausoleum of that kind of stature, and not to say a small city, but a small city is kind of unusual, I will say. Because in Rochester, you can go to Mount Hope and you will see mausoleums and structures and burial sites very elaborated. So it's very cool to go down Harvester and into the cemetery and see the monument, see the Morgan Monument, the Ellicott section, which I included right there. And this is a very fun photo of the cemetery. When I looked up photos, this was one that I was like, oh, I would go for a walk in the leaves, surrounded by dead bodies, walking through. Hopefully I don't step in a hole and step into a grave.
They don't give you any trouble.
No. I told Ryan about Sharon Java. I said, it must not be that fun. She ain't got nobody to talk to. They're all around. I wouldn't want to be an groundskeeper, because that's very, very silent.
Well, Bill Kaufman gets his inspiration. He goes over there and sits on the bench for writing.
He must be a secret spiritualist, because I don't think I can just sit there in silence. He must be able to talk to the dead. But even last week, now we do things, even now we do cemetery tours across the nation. We just did ours last Saturday. Sharon did hers. The dead came alive. Mr. Eli Fish was there. Yeah, his ghost is right behind you, right? So even today, we still have elaborated on the sense of death with those kind of tours and our look towards cemeteries, because people find them spooky. They still go and kind of do things in them, like cemetery tours. We do even our ghost walks. So those are kind of our own ways of mourning practices, but it's definitely not like it used to be. So thank you. If you have any questions, I will take them.
Was the mourning period and tradition, if you had a child that passed away, would it typically be the same period, same?
So children were a lot different. So for, like, say siblings, so we actually have Eugene Richmond mourning dress for his twin brother in the cemetery exhibit. So if you were mourning your sibling, you would often mourn for about a year, but a lot of times mothers would mourn almost their whole life.
Yeah.
Not to the extent of this, but they would often still wear pieces of black, dark colors. It was very thought of for you to mourn your children until you were dead yourself. So, but if you were mourning a sibling, it was a lot different. I think of the Morgan house in Brockport, because Sarah outlived her whole family. She mourned her whole family until her death, but she didn't wear mourning clothes. We have photos of her. She didn't really show that part of her life for her siblings, but we have photos of her mom wearing black clothes once one of her children died, even when she was still married, and she continued that till her death. So it's very different for kids.
Is there any celebration of life at all during the Victorian era?
So it wasn't really a celebration. So what a lot of families did is have kind of meeting periods in their parlors. They would often set up the family in the parlor, and you could come during calling hours, which we have today, but at a funeral home. You would often do that at your own home. And they would just come in, hand you the card, you would walk in, pay your respects, say hi to the family, and leave. It was very common for people to do that, and it was very thought upon for you to go do that. I mean, I hope when I die, people go to my calling hours, but can't make that promise.
I won't be there.
Well, I know that.
Some things to be thankful.
Yeah, but even in the home, it became kind of a funeral parlor itself. It was very custom for people to cover their mirrors with black veils, so you couldn't look into the mirror and look at your vanity. That was thought of disrespectful. You typically had flowers everywhere that people had sent you. It was very, almost like a funeral parlor, even at home. And at the Cobblestone Museum, they actually have a cooling casket in one of their houses. So what that is that you would have calling hours at your home with the deceased in your parlor, and would be kind of a cooler essentially. So you put ice in the bottom and you rest the body on top of it with the wood between it, and it would have a kind of an opening for you to look in. So that was very interesting to go see at the Cobblestone Museum. I forget which house it's in, but it's next to the church.
Didn't they stop the clocks too until the body was buried? Is that something I read somewhere?
That was a custom, but it wasn't very common, just because people were still working. So you stop the clock, you're not gonna know what time it is, you gotta get your day going. So people still did have their clocks. Some people did it, that was like all the way, but people didn't always do that. It wasn't uncommon, but it wasn't common for people to do.
How about down through the classes? How different would it be, like a very poor person living in the village of Batavia before 1900?
So the only big difference, not only, you would still mourn for that period of time, but you wouldn't have the elaborateness that the upper classes did. You wouldn't have the elaborate funerals, you wouldn't have the handmade gowns, you wouldn't have that stationery because you were still working.
Right.
You still had to go back and do work, you had to get your life together, you still had to do all that. These people did not have to do that. These women would probably have stayed home for months and months and months and didn't even go out of their house. It wasn't very custom for women in mourning to leave their perimeter of their home. You would often be able to go out into your yard and kind of walk around, but you would most likely not go to markets. You wouldn't go to the dry goods store, you would send somebody for you. But for the working class and the horror classes, you still had to do that. You didn't have the accessibility that these women did, or men, so you would still mourn, but you would have to do your daily life routine still. So it was very different, but you would still mourn for that period.
No, my grandfather passed away in the 90s. My grandmother, now they were Italian, my grandmother went through, not the elaborate dress, she wore nothing but black and did not leave her house. I don't think it was a year, but it was months. We would go pick up her groceries. And I kept saying, Grandma, why can't you walk? She said, we just don't do that.
Yeah, there's still.
You wanted to see her, you went and visited.
Yeah, there's still some cultures that do that today, but it's not as prevalent as it was or as common. I mean, I remember when my dad's great-grandmother, her husband passed away, she did the same thing. But as time went on, my dad's mom, when that happened, did not happen.
So it's the past generations and it's changing as we go.
Yeah, there are still some religions and cultures that push this kind of mourning, but not to the extent of what it was.
This is related. I was reading a Reader's Digest article about, AI is a subject of conversation and
Yeah,
debate.
the AI.
And what they're doing, there's a company there probably is more than one company that will create a digital avatar of your parents.
Mm-hmm.
They interview the parents and they ask interesting, what are you interested in and such. And people, when the parent passes away, you can, and is that good for people?
I haven't read on much about it. Rich just mentioned that to us the other day.
It's the creepiest thing yet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
I don't know if you can get any creepy.
I personally wouldn't do anything with it. That's just a little creepy to me. But if it helps people, sure.
Yeah.
Not gonna help me, because that I feel is just.
So what did they do?
You can't stop.
Did they create a robot or just what?
No, you go and interact with your, and it's interactive. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
But it's very kind of first wave technology. It's kind of, it can't understand some of your questions as the living person or comments.
Mm-hmm.
You have to talk slowly.
Yeah. And what I had told Rich when he mentioned it, I was like, it's not really, you can generate the voice, but it's still not a real response. It's just generating the response for you. Is it nice to hear their voice? Probably. But it's still not a real response.
It's just version 1.
Yeah.
We're on, what are we, what's the iPhone 18, 19?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It will continue to evolve.
Oh, you'll probably have a hologram soon.
That's right. You'll be speaking to the future, that's what.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
No,
Excellent.
thank you.
Well, thank you again, Tyler, for the excellent presentation. The cemetery exhibit is up for another week or so we still have some time to check it out. We do have a guest speaker tonight too, so for anybody who really wants to spend a lot of time with us today, you can come on in. There we go. We already got some. So Amy Truesdell will be coming. She is an author previously residing in Maine, now in Wisconsin. She just moved, so that was a big thing in her life. But she wrote a book based on the letters of her ancestor, Roland Truesdell, who was from the Binghamton area and served in the Civil War. So she'll be sharing the experiences that she gleaned from his letters. So that's at 7 o'clock tonight. And then our last ghost walk is tomorrow, but as of right now, it's sold out. So I'm sorry if you didn't get your ticket in time, but we're very excited that we're going out with a bang on that. And then the next event, we have a guest speaker next Wednesday, November 1st, and this one I don't think anybody should miss because it is Chris Mikowski, who is a very well-known Civil War historian, one of the editors of the Emerging Civil War series, and a big wig on the Central Virginia Civil War Trust, as well as many other things. But he will be talking on Grant's last battle, so it's about Ulysses S. Grant at the end of his life and how he kind of came to terms with his career while he was dealing with cancer. So feel free to stop by for that. And we have another guest speaker on November 7th. Stephen Huff will be talking about his new book, Resting Among Us. So actually kind of applicable to what we just talked about, but he went around New York State and documented where many famous authors are actually buried. And one he talks about is John Gardner here in Batavia. So that'll be Tuesday, November 7th, so be sure to check that out as well. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Be sure to grab a donut on your way out, or another cup of coffee, and we will see you next time.
All right.
If you guys can come check out the rest.
My buddy Steve is
You mentioned